Hi everyone, Fresh here, and I'm here to tell you why the Primary Arms SLX 5X Microprism is one of the most disruptive products to ever enter the prism scope market. Before we start, however, let's talk about 5X magnification in fixed power scopes for a moment. In my 3X microprism video, I described one of the largest segments of the prism scope population, if you will, the 3X. Where 3x magnification thrives in mid to short to mid-range out to 600 yards, 5x has a place of its own, offset just a little bit. If we utilize our 2x magnification per 100 yard rule, you should expect that PID should be fairly easy up to about 250 yards. If we utilize our magnification rule of 1x per 100 yards, you should expect decent combat effectiveness, strictly for shooting, up to about 500 yards. And if we go into our previously stated wildcard rule of 1/2x magnification per 100 yards, you should be able to expect these prism scopes at about 5x to be able to reach targets with a sufficient carbine or rifle setup out to 1,000 yards. Check out my 1,000 yard 5.56 video to show you how that's done. Even despite these rules and distances that we've provided, why would anyone want a 5x prism? It tends to be a high amount of magnification in such a lightweight platform that's supposed to be used rather quickly in certain setups. And so here's a trick with 5x prisms. They tend to compete fairly well with 1 to 5 and 1 to 6 LPVOs when you put a piggybacked red dot on top of them. The magnification between 5 to 6x isn't nearly as significant as the difference between 2 to 3x percentage-wise. Though the magnification switch is not always ergonomically advantageous and doesn't have continuous magnification adjustments, it offers a rugged and simple solution to the variable magnification problem. And, as we'll get to here in a moment, sometimes offering more sighting solutions and flexibilities than some LPVOs. Let's dive into the 5X product segment, starting with some optical performance metrics. Primary Arms was one of the earlier adopters to the 5x magnification segment. Their 5x Gen 3 SLX Prism was an excellent entry into the fray. It features a field of view of 18.8 feet at 100 yards. This yields a norm FOV score of 94, which is actually a little bit more acceptable than you think. Cementing this new segment of 5x Gen 2 and Gen 3 battle prisms, Burris decided to come out with their AR-536. It's a similar body to their AR-332 and boasts a decent field of view of 20 feet at 100 yards, yielding a respectable norm score of 100. Again, 5x magnification and with a norm FOV that approaches LPVO territory. Not too bad. Not to be outdone by potential competitors and potentially pursuing a military contract, Burris decided to come out with their TMPR system. It came in a 3x and this following 5x model here. It boasted an enlarged field of view of 24 feet at 100 yards, yielding a norm FOV of 120. Something tells me that Burris was potentially trying to compete with the TA-31 or TA-11. Though this particular narrative is going to be chronologically a little bit messy, let's talk about Burris's recent release in their RT line. I talked about their RT3 a little bit earlier, and shortly after they released this RT5 model. It's a much smaller prism, boasting a field of view of 18 feet at 100 yards, yielding a norm FOV of 90, which is a little bit worse than the Primary Arms 5X Gen 3. For such a small unit, though, that looks like decent optical performance. The further I went down this 5X rabbit hole, however, the stranger and stranger I found the prisms to be. Barska, known for making budget scopes, came out with this ARX 5x40, which boasts a massive 40mm objective. It also boasts a gargantuan 28.8 feet at 100 yards. This may not seem like much compared to the 3X microprism from Primary Arms, but when we look at its norm FOV, it ends up with a score of 144, which is very close to being as wide as the ACOG. LS Sniper Systems also joined the fray with their 5x50 fixed prism sight, also boasting something along the lines of 28.4 feet at 100 yards, giving a norm FOV of 142, again, close to the ACOG. So what if Trijicon really decided to compete with Barska and LS? Their TA50 is a 5.5 magnification prism that boasts an FOV of 18.4 feet at 100 yards, giving you a norm FOV of 101.2. Quite respectable, but seems to fall short of some of the cheaper prisms that are on this list so far. This is unfortunate, because if you take any ACOG lower than the TA11 and any ACOG of higher magnification than the TA31, you start to lose both field of view and eye relief respectively. That's probably the subject for another video though. So you have a couple of these 5x prisms so far, some decent red dots, and even some excellent 1x prisms that can be worked at with a magnifier. What if we tried our hand at a 5x flip to side unit? In comes EOTech's G45, boasting a field of view of 23 feet at 100 yards, giving a respectable 115 norm FOV score. I'll take that kind of sight picture any day. Now let's go super cheap again in the Airsoft Amazon Special grade. Monstrum recently released the Blackbird 5x30 and their Marksman 5x24. Despite the difference in their physical optical size and their scope body makeup, they both have a field of view of 18 feet at 100 yards and a norm score of 90. Decent, but not great. Remember those battle prisms that we talked about before? Let's call these the Gen 3 or Gen 4 battle prisms. These scopes are physically larger, heavier, and boast quite a bit of optical power. Something that a machine gunner, for example, in a squadron would appreciate. Steiner with their T536 has an FOV of 23.7 feet at 100 yards, giving a norm FOV score of 118.5, which already exceeds about 95% of the 1x that you could see on high-end LPVOs. SIG recently came out with their Bravo 5 Prism sight, and I hope it doesn't get discontinued, because it's got a great field of view of 26.3 feet at 100 yards, giving a norm FOV score of 131.3. Another recent contender here is Swamp Fox with their Saber 5X. It has an IMAX-sized field of view of 52.5 feet at 100 yards, yielding a astonishing norm score of 262.5. I may have to get my hands on one of these scopes sometime, because I can't even imagine what that kind of field of view even looks like with that kind of magnification. This next scope should be familiar to you because it's been making circulation around the internet and is actually the reason that I started this channel in the first place. The Vortex Spitfire 5X yields an impressive 23.3 feet at 100 yards and a norm score of 116.5. So how does our 5X Micro Prism compare to all these giants so far? Its 21 feet at 100 yards, yielding a norm score of 105, isn't particularly impressive so far. It's about mid to back of the pack so far. Let's keep on going here. The same pattern that we've seen with our 3X prisms tends to be present in this 5X segment as well. A lot of the older battle prisms tend to have longer eye relief, somewhere in the 3 to 3.5 inch range. A straight prism will sometimes go into 1X territory at about 6 inches. This essentially makes the Marksman 5-24, if this rating is correct, one of the longest eye relief prisms in the market in general. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the more military-focused optics, such as the Burris TPMR, the TA50, and the SIG Bravo 5. Around here, you're going to be somewhere in the 2 to 2.5 inch region. Burris's RT5, the EOTech G45 magnifier, and the Swamp Fox Saber are going to exceed that only by a little bit to about 2.6 inches. The rest of the more popular prisms will be at about the 2.7 inch range, and the likes of the Barska ARX will exceed that only by a slight amount. Now these measurements might not mean a whole lot, because eye relief tends to be a bit of a range. This range also is experienced differently with different scopes. Whether these be variable or fixed powered scopes, you could expect 3 different conditions when it comes to eye relief. The first type of scope here is what is called a forward-biased scope. When you decide to venture inside the scope's eye relief range, typically that's the point where the black ring starts to get thicker, the scope is still quite a bit tolerant of that until it reaches the point where your eye box becomes limited. Hence, forward bias. The second situation is what I call rear bias. In forward bias, it's the opposite situation. If you try to go inside the scope's eye relief range, so a little bit closer, you're going to quickly realize that your eye box shrinks very quickly. The scope, however, is very tolerant when you move away from it. Your eye box doesn't become limited right away. Eventually you reach a point where your sight picture and eye box are limited, but this presents a lot of potential flexibility in your setup and stock position. The third type is what I call symmetric bias. Within the rated eye relief, you can expect forward bias and rear bias, or neither at all. In a neither case, you have the least flexible eye relief possible. Go too far forward, your eye box gets limited. Go too far back, same thing. It is a little bit rarer for me to see scopes of this symmetric bias setup. An attribute that I've emphasized quite a bit on this channel is the physical size of the optic. If the optic takes up less space, there's more room to put accessories such as laser aiming modules, brass catcher mounts, and other types of wire management. A physically smaller scope combined with a cantilever mount also allows taller shooters to still get the proper eye relief, both for night vision and for daytime shooting. Looking at this list, the TA50 and Burris TPMR are the largest of the bunch. Absolutely gargantuan scopes at 11 to 12 inches. The pack does start getting a little bit better when you get to the Steiner, SIG, Swamp Fox, the Barska ARX, and the first three Gen 3 battle prisms in the list. The physical size starts to get a little bit better with the Steiner, SIG, and the Swamp Fox, as well as the older primary arms and Burris AR3 536 being somewhere between 5 to 6.5 inches. And somehow the Barska ARX 5x40 tends to go into about 6.5 inch range, yet just seems physically very imposing and doesn't allow for a lot of accessories, not being an LPVO. The LS 5x50 also could use a bit of a diet physically. It's nearly 8.3 inches in length, not really allowing for a whole lot past what an LPVO can give you. Though the EOTech G45 magnifier is less than 4 inches, it needs to be paired with a red dot to be useful. The complete package, therefore, is probably closer to the physical length of the LS 5x50. The smallest prisms in this pack, therefore, not surprisingly, are the RT5. The two Monstrum prisms are Vortex Spitfire 5X and are described 5X microprism. New viewers and returning viewers may notice that I tend to put an overemphasis on optic weight. In talking with a couple of other creators, this warrants a deeper discussion into the matter. Our Gen 3 battle prisms up at the top, due to their physical size, tend to be in the 18.5 to 19 ounce range. This is not an absolute deal breaker, but it tends to make a bare 5.56 setup feel a little bit heavy. These probably work a little bit better for recoil management on something like a AR308. The Burris RT5 manages to be an astonishing 10 ounces lighter than the TPMR. Unsurprisingly, due to the ARX's physical size, it's weighing somewhere at 19.2 ounces. The LS 5x50, also physically imposing, is closer to 20.5 inches. Trijicon's TA50 ACOG, unsurprisingly, being the largest scope of this bunch, is at about 25.6 ounces on the scale. EOTech's G45, being one of the heavier magnifiers, is almost 13 ounces. Pair this G45 with a 5-ounce red dot sight at the lower end and a 8-ounce prism sight, preferably a 1X, in the higher end, and you're going to end up with a weight that's similar to those shown above. Monstrum's Blackbird 5x30 is at about 12 ounces, and the Marksman 5x24 is at 11. Steiner's T536 doesn't quite break the 18-ounce range. In some ways, it can feel like an ergonomic analog to the TA31. Despite being about the same size, Bravo 5 Chungus is coming in at 23 ounces. And again, all that field of view comes in at a cost, because the Swamp Fox Saber 5X is almost 25 ounces. Very close to the likes of some LPVOs. Coming in at a far more reasonable 10.3 ounces is our Vortex Spitfire 5X, and again was part of the reason that I just fell in love with it. Put this guy on any 16-inch carbine and it will balance absolutely beautifully. Vortex, however, has extremely stiff competition though, because our primary arms 5X microprism weighs in at an astonishing 8.5 ounces. Only a half an ounce heavier than their 3X microprism. A rather sore conversation that comes up in prism optics sometimes is the click graduation for adjustment. The Vortex Spitfire 5X and Burris RT5 suffer from having too coarse of an adjustment, about 1 MOA per click. If you're going to have this much magnification in a prism for PID, and yet want a little bit more precision, why wouldn't you want your clicks to be a little bit more precise so you can get a better zero? I have been able to work with 1 MOA clicks in the past, but I'm starting to think that my success came out purely out of luck. Not every click is exactly 1 MOA, and likely my clicks were probably a little bit more precise in one direction versus another due to the slop. A lot of mid-pack prisms here are at about half MOA per click. This I think is enough to get you to true the prism out at 300 yards. The Steiner will get you a little bit more precision at about 1 centimeter at 100 meters. This translates to about 0.4 MOA per click. Not evenly spaced, but it'll work in most situations. You also have an unusual increment of 1/3 MOA per click, shown in the primary arms 5X Gen 3 and the Burris AR536. And then finally, you get the 5X microprism. Then we have our primary arms 5X microprism, giving us fine clicks at 1/4 MOA per click, matched only by the ARX 5x40 and the Burris TMPR. And then finally, in Trigicon ACOG fashion, you have more of a length increment per click, yielding about a 0.2 MOA per click. Now, I did list battery life, but I don't have a whole lot of data for most of these prisms, except for the primary arms 5X. Depending on the setting that you pick, you are anywhere between 29,000 and 50,000 hours of battery life. And I kind of believe it here because the 5X microprism doesn't have a terrible amount of area that it needs to illuminate in its reticle. It's just the baby chevron, and that's it. I would say as more manufacturers get their battery life schedules up to date, I'd be glad to correct this column. Another nice thing about Prism optics compared to their variable power counterparts is that you can get decent glass for not a whole lot of money. The whole pricing structure of a particular roster tends to go out of whack when you start seeing prisms that are costing $900 or more. You may or may not be getting more durability, but then your optical quality tends to suffer in some ways, despite having slightly better glass. So how do we quantify what would be a low-risk purchase in the 5X segment? Using this quick little formula here, I came up with a bang for your buck score again. What does this tell us exactly? Well, spending a little bit more money on this prism doesn't necessarily give you the maximum performance. Your 5.5 ACOG and your Burris TMPR didn't score so well in this case. And it doesn't take much for some promising looking products like the Burris RT5 to end up with a low score. Despite the primary arms 5X microprism's shortcomings on field of view, it ended up being the shortest, lightest, had decent eye relief, and extremely precise click adjustment. This balance of proper features is what makes this so disruptive in this segment. Once again, this video is getting a little bit too long. Stay tuned for part 2, where we examine the glass quality, shooting characteristics, and some of the physical features of the 5X Prism. Don't forget to subscribe, ring that bell, hit that like button, and send me any positive or negative reviews on my content. I'll see you guys in part 2.